To studio, Professor Eugene Kontorovich, a constitutional and international law lecturer at George Mason University and director of the Kohelet Policy Forum. So, Professor, thank you so much for being here in studio.
Pleasure.
The fact that these negotiations between Israel and Lebanon are even taking place in the wake of the Abraham Accords and this warming ties between Israel and certain Arab nations seems significant in itself. Break down for us your thoughts.
Yeah, it is really quite significant, and it's like the Abraham Accords, the work of very long and serious diplomacy by the United States, by Jared Kushner. And it's not a full-fledged opening of relations, mutual recognition, like with the UAE and other Gulf states. So it may seem like, what's the big deal? But on the other hand, relations with Lebanon have previously been much worse. Lebanon has fought and has been part of every war against Israel since 1948. They are at war with Israel, and they've never even recognized the existence of Israel. So the UAE, for example, always had warm behind-the-scenes relations with Israel. So a rising tide lifts all boats. So the UAE, which already had good relations, the new spirit of the U.S. administration turned that into full recognition. And Lebanon, which is in a state of war, is now at least in formal negotiations.
And when you say exactly that, we see this as a formal open discussion about negotiations in itself. What does it mean specifically for Hezbollah, given its role within Lebanon right now, and of course its view on Israel?
Yeah, I think this tends to be probably against Hezbollah's wishes, and it's significantly successful in that Hezbollah largely controls the government of Lebanon, but this shows it doesn't completely control it, and we can see that they've already been very frustrated by this development. And it tends to show, perhaps their weakening influence in the wake of the catastrophic explosion that they were responsible for in the port of Beirut.
And the situation would seemingly be more complicated by the fact that, of course, Lebanon is an ally to Iran. How is Tehran responding to all these developments right now?
So we can tell by Hezbollah's reaction, because Hezbollah is Iran, and Hezbollah is very displeased by these negotiations. Obviously, this is an attempt to try to tamp down the influence of Hezbollah, at least on Lebanese foreign policy, because Hezbollah says there's no such thing as Israel. There's a Zionist entity. And if they're negotiating a border between Lebanon and Israel, that must mean there is an Israel, and that must be very frustrating for Iran.
And, of course, the signing of the Abraham Accords, a huge development here, of course, in the Middle East, and specifically a joyous time for most in Israel to see that. But much was made then and even since then, both by Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, saying more countries are going to follow in the footsteps of the UAE and of Bahrain. I'm going to put you on the spot. Yeah. Who is likely to be next?
It's very hard to say, but I think Oman is going to be one of the early ones. For example, Sudan is clearly on the list, but the problem is Sudan does not actually have a normal government. They have a military junta where it's unclear amongst themselves who's in charge and who's calling the shots. So I think Oman is a realistic next candidate.
Professor Eugene Kontorovich, we look forward to having more discussions as the situation here unfolds in the Middle East. As always, we appreciate your insight on I24 News. Thank you.
Thank you so much.